Hello and welcome back to my channel, and today I'm counting down my top 10 films by Roberto Rossellini, the great Italian film director. For me, one of the truly great directors of the 20th century, and actually one of the most important artists full stop of the 20th century, though you wouldn't know it these days. How many people actually watch Rossellini's films these days? They pay him lip service, but they don't pay him much attention. There's still many of his films that are not available subtitled in Britain on DVD and Blu-ray. And I vividly remember when I was studying film at university, they showed Viaggio in Italia, Journey to Italy, one day on screen, and I was the only person in the lecture theatre that liked it. I felt very small. What's happened to Roberto Rossellini? After all, this is a man who recreated cinema 3 times. At the end of the war in 1945, as Italy was liberated, a new kind of cinema was being born. It was partly done through financial restrictions and studio restrictions, so the cameras were taken out onto the streets. But this sort of liberated cinema in Italy. They started using non-professional actors, just people in the streets, using their stories and true experiences of what had happened into the war. And so they mixed narrative cinema with documentary, and it was called neorealism. Roberto Rossellini's film Roma Città Aperta, or Rome Open City, was the film that really brought this to the world. Some people credit Ossessioni by Visconti as being the first true neorealist film, but I think Rome Open City was the one that brought it to the masses, as it were. And in so doing, he created, I think, the springtime of cinema after the winter of the Second World War. It was the breakthrough of light and a new way of looking at the world. It was very, very important, and it laid the foundation stones for what would become European cinema in the post-war period. But then, 5 years later, he did it again, and this time from a peculiar source. He had an affair, a very public and very controversial affair, with Ingrid Bergman, who at that time was a major Hollywood star. It's kind of laughable to look back now, but this affair scandalised the world, particularly Italy and America, because, she was married and she had a child, and she went off with this Italian, and she had a baby out of wedlock with him. Goodness me, what a hussy. It was terrible stuff. But also it was fascinating, right? Because here was this kind of Hollywood star, this epitome of glamour, right? And she went off with an art house serious director. That was also kind of fascinating about it. And this unusual affair led to a very unusual film, Stromboli. And what Rossellini did, Rossellini was always looking for the truth. So he took the truth of his situation. He took his Hollywood star and he plonked her in a neorealist film and watched what happened. Now that might sound kind of meta-cinema-ish, and I suppose in a way Stromboli is interested in the counterpoint of this star who is recognised by everyone, counterpointed with all these, villagers and fishermen in the island of Stromboli who are not known, who are just part of the mass, and looking at that contrast. But it also leads to something else and something far more interesting and groundbreaking. You see, the subject, the truth of Rossellini's film is Ingrid Bergman herself. The story is that she plays a refugee who just marries a guy to get out of the situation she's in. He's a fisherman in Stromboli, this island off the coast of Italy. And so she goes to the island. And what Rossellini does, he just takes the camera and watches her. And this is what's important. He's watching her. He's not interested in the narrative, he's not interested in the story. He's interested in her reactions, in her personality, in her psychology, not her character. Not her narrative motivation, simply in watching her. How does she react to the local children? How does she react to the local people? How does she seem in this landscape? So we're starting to move away from narrative and character towards personality and psychology. And so what often in the film, he just lets the narrative fall apart and he just watches her in dead time, right? Here is the beginnings of European art house cinema. Not only that, but what he's also starting to explore is the modern woman, which will become the great subject of European art house cinema. So in many ways, this is a landmark film, one of those stepping stones films in the development of film. It's there with Citizen Kane, with Breathless and L'Avventura and, Birth of a Nation. It belongs in that company, yet it never gets rated as highly, and it really needs to be. But then, 15 or 16 years later, he did it again. At this point, neorealism had run its course. And it's quite interesting to look back. A lot of Italian film critics got very upset about this, and they felt that people like Visconti and Fellini and Rossellini, who were the main figures, betrayed neorealism, and went off in their own way and into narrative, And there was this great disillusionment. And Rossellini himself became very disillusioned with cinema. So he turned to television. And he started to make a new kind of documentary, a historical documentary. He made a film called The Rise to Power of Louis XIV, sometimes called The Taking of Power by Louis XIV, whatever. And what he did was, instead of making a sort of voiceover commentary with slides and art, works of art to illustrate it, he recreates the world of Louis XIV's court. He doesn't introduce a story or a narrative. He doesn't really have much script. He just shows scenes from the life of the court. And what he's trying to do, he's trying to recreate history as it was experienced by those at the time, on its own terms. He's trying to make us understand history and the development of Europe purely through making us get inside it, into its textures, to see its relationships. You see, most historical films or period dramas, they're set in history, but they're not of history. They're written for a modern audience, and they suit the ideas and mores of a modern audience. And so they give a distorted impression of history. Certainly if you've seen any modern BBC period costume dramas, you know what I'm talking about. Rossellini wanted to get away from this. He wanted us to see history as the people at the time understood it. It's a kind of cinema that I love, actually, but very few directors have done it. Eric Romer did it in Percival the Gaulois and Lady and the Duke. To a certain extent, Peter Watkins, the British documentarist, did it in his own way. He filmed the Battle of Culloden, but he filmed it like it was a modern newsreel to get the freshness and immediacy of it, so that it wasn't sort of under the patina of history, but was brought to life right in front of you. And similarly, Rossellini is trying to bring history to life by immersing us in it, not telling us about it, not instructing us or pointing the finger, but just immersing us in it. A lot of people just pay lip service to these historical documentaries of Rossellini, don't really like them. I do. I'm one of the few people who cares for them. But the point is, 3 times over, this guy completely changed his art form. Extraordinary achievement. Now, before we go any further with Rossellini, we have to go back right to the very beginning. Rossellini's beginnings as a film director are very seldom talked about. They're one of cinema's guilty secrets. You see, because in the war, Rossellini made propaganda films for the fascists. He was actually friendly with Benito Mussolini's son. And this has led to some accusations of hypocrisy about Rossellini, and hypocrisy about the whole, neorealist movement. I remember reading a critic, an Italian critic, who calls himself the Celluloid Liberation Front, who made this point and discarded Rossellini, said he's a hypocrite. I don't feel that way, but I do feel he's right. We should talk about Rossellini's fascistic beginnings, and it's wrong that this is so glibly, shoved aside. But I find it interesting. And I find it, in some ways, it cuts to what I find so interesting about Rossellini in general. Rossellini, as a director, wants to get to the truth. Now, it's his truth, okay, but it's a truth. And that's all he cares about. Now, for me, I think it's fair to say Rossellini was a small c conservative. Throughout his work, you can see that he is deeply Catholic, and his faith is important. I think he believes in the old, the state, military, church. I think he believes in the family. I think he carries those little prejudices of the small c conservative middle class. For example, throughout his work, there's a tinge of Anglophobia. Check out in the film Paisa the way he represents the British general who's coming to liberate the Italian town. And he dresses him up as Montgomery, who was the British chief of staff, and makes him out to be a bit of a fool. And there's a wonderful line in the last episode of Paisa where, you know, the Americans and the partisans have got together on the delta of the River Po, fighting this guerrilla war against the Nazis. And two airmen, I think it's two airmen, parachute out of their hit plane. And there's a line where it says, "Who is it?" And they go, "It's an Englishman." And they go, "Well, you can't have everything. It's better than nothing." Incredible Anglophobia. And this Anglophobia is found all through Rossellini's work. And of course, that's a sort of, it's a legacy of what happened in the 1920s and 1930s when, of course, the fascists, the Italian fascists, invaded Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, and tried to create their own European empire, you know, like the French had, like the Germans had, and of course like the British had. And the British and the French bitterly criticised it, and Mussolini was saying, look at the hypocrisy. And there was this, you know, huge Anglophobia for this reason within some of the Italian middle classes. And you still see that. It's still there in Rossellini's work. So we shouldn't ignore that. But you see, that's what I find interesting about Rossellini. Despite that, despite the fact that he was quite a typical small c conservative middle class man, he still wanted to find the truth in his society. And it's that relationship between a conservative man who still wants to unpick what's underneath the surface and what's true. I can't remember whether it was André Bazin or Jacques Rivette said, is heroic. Now, what do I mean when I say that Rossellini is looking for truth? What do I mean by that? Well, the reason why Rossellini is something of a hard sell to modern generations who've grown up on Star Wars and Steven Spielberg, not that I'm here to diss those things, right? I like them, right? But you've got generations of people who've brought up on the idea that cinema is spectacle, you know, with very obvious production quality, great special effects, the money's up there on screen, right? And you have a system, the Oscars, that tells you that what film is made up of is this. I'm going to move the camera. It's made up of script, cinematography, production design, costume, makeup. You get the idea, right? Now, this is how Rossellini approaches cinema. He goes, right, like Reggie Perrin. Now, what do I want here? What do I want to get at? That, the truth. And that's the only thing that matters. Now, we're all used to the idea that Bresson, right, you know, Bresson, the holy god of cinema, you know, is always worshipped by cinephiles. Because as a director, I'll just move my microphone up a little bit. As a director, what he did was, he had this theory of there's too many easy emotional triggers in cinema. So let's get rid of them. Let's pass away all the melodramatic triggers, everything easy, bring it all down. You purify, you cleanse, you declutter. You get to this purer, more rigorous form of cinema. Well, in a sense, Rossellini was already getting there, but from a slightly different route. What he was saying is, no, you can use all those elements, but they're not important. And they don't have to be brilliant, right? All that matters is that you use them as tools to get to this one element that matters, which is the truth. Now, I'll try and illustrate what I mean by this by taking the film Viaggio in Italia, Journey to Italy. Now, what happens in this film? It starts off, an English couple, the woman is played by Ingrid Bergman and the man is played by George Sanders, are travelling in a car. The cinematography is a muddy, unspectacular black and white. They're in a car, static shot, and they're just talking, and they've got this drone of the car, and the landscape outside is flat and featureless. it's almost as though Rossellini is deliberately boring us. Right? This is the start of the film, right? And most of the film is going to go along in this kind of low, monotonous drone of dramatic style, right? In flat rooms with kind of rather ordinary cinematography, right? There's very little set pieces, there's very little conflict or dynamism, right? And then they start bickering. They're not getting on very well, this couple. He goes off and starts flirting with ladies in the area, and she goes to museums. And you get these long bits where she goes to a museum and the guy's just showing around the statues and teaching you about Roman history and teaching you about the history of, European civilization. Where's this going? And then, the relationship gets worse and worse. But it's all done at this even tempo. And then they're staying in Naples, and they go to the ruins of Pompeii. And the archaeologists are uncovering these two new bodies they've found. Two lovers holding each other tightly in their arms as the ash falls on them and coats them forever, keeping them locked in this embrace for eternity. And Ingrid Bergman screams. There's an outbreak of emotion. She runs off. George Sanders goes to comfort her. Now, in any sort of melodramatic romantic movie, this would be a high point, right, of the movie. And there'd be romantic, photography and close-ups getting as they kiss each other. No. What Rossellini does is they simply walk out of Pompeii. They just walk along at a normal pace, one behind the other. The only thing that tells you that there's any emotion is the music, which is highly florid and melodramatic. And that tells you the emotions that are going on inside them. But visually, it's very bland. They get back in the car, the drone of the car. They're bickering again. They decide to divorce. Suddenly, there's something in the way of the car. There's a religious ceremony going on. They get out of the car. They're still bickering. And then you get the moment of truth. The crowd surges forward, and Ingrid Bergman is caught in the crowd. She turns and screams, "Alex!" with her arm outstretched like that. That shot is on screen mere seconds. Blink and you'll miss it. It is the truth of the film. The whole film is based around that shot. Just this blast of truth. Everything else is subordinated to make it work. Because suddenly, they've been bickering away and suddenly, bang, he's lost her. And this is where the film achieves its brilliance, right? Remember what I was saying, that Rossellini is trying to look at the reality of these stars in a documentary setting. So we cut to George Sanders. He doesn't know what's going on. He, like the character, is in the hands of fate. The crowd surges forward. He's sort of pushed along with them. You can see the actor, just like the character, doesn't really know what's happening to him. And then, eventually, he catches up with Ingrid Bergman. They embrace, say, I love you, I won't ever want to leave you. People think that this is ridiculous. People think this is soppy and stupid. But in fact, what's happened is that one shot has exploded the truth to him and to her of their relationship, that they do love each other, and they do need each other. And they come together under this religious banner, and they're sort of symbolically remarried. And then, brilliantly, the camera pulls away, pans away, and you see the arm of the camera, the shadow of the camera, over the crowd. Even there, Rossellini doesn't take away from the truth. He shows you the truth of the way the film is being made, while he's showing you the truth of what's going on between this couple. I think it's an extraordinary ending. And so what I'm saying is that everything is subordinated to making you feel the truth of the moment. That's the only thing that matters. He doesn't care if the cinematography is sometimes quite bland. He doesn't care if some of the dialogue or some of the acting from the amateurs is not very good. Some of it might be melodramatic. He doesn't care. All he cares about is getting you to feel the truth of that particular moment. And that is something. The reason why Journey to Italy is so important to me as a film is because more than any other director, Rossellini taught me that the real truth of any artwork is in its conception. its overall philosophy, not in its individual qualities, whether it's got good cinematography or good music. It's in the overall approach you take and what you're trying to get to. That's the kernel of it. And that's what that film showed me and why it's so precious to me. Let's get into the top 10. Now, at number 10 is an unusual film in Rossellini's filmography that you can find as an extra on the BFI's Blu-ray release of Jean Renoir's The River, the best extra ever, in my opinion. Now, I have a sort of fascination with films made about India, and particularly the sort of India in the Empire period, made by Westerners. I don't know why, but there's a really interesting set of films. There's The River by Renoir, there's Black Narcissus by Michael Pell and Emmerich Pressburger, there's India Song by Marguerite Duras, and there is India Matribhumi by Roberto Rossellini. Now, ostensibly this is a documentary. It's a documentary in 4 parts that sort of tells 4 fictional tales, almost folkloric tales. The first tale is, if you like elephants, get it watched, because there's a wonderful scene where the elephant handlers are bathing their elephants in the river. It's gorgeous. The cinematography is excellent throughout. Then there's another tale about an architect who's working on building a dam. Another tale about a man who's worried about the tigers being pushed out of their habitat by local builders. And then the final story, which is very moving, which is about a little monkey. He's a pet of this guy, and the guy dies out in the wild, but the monkey is still chained to him. And what happens to the little monkey? It's a very interesting film. I think for modern audiences, it might seem slightly patronising and condescending portrait of India. But I think it should be seen in the context of the time it was made and the spirit in which it was made. I think it's a very beautiful, very humanist film that also shows a sympathy for animals as well as humans. Animals are almost as important as humans in the movie. Try it out. It's really interesting. In 9th place is one of the major neorealist films, Germany Year Zero. Germany Year Zero is a very difficult watch. It's about an adolescent boy living in the burnt out shell of Germany after the Second World War. Again, the story is purely melodramatic. At one point, he takes a bottle marked poison out of the cupboard. You know what he's going to do with it. But that's not really the point. What Rossellini wanted to show was the reality of post-war Europe, these bombed out cities, and the desolate lives they create. The desolation outside mirrors the desolation inside. You'll never forget the ending, when the boy walks to his doom. It's shocking. Even today, it's still incredibly shocking. Very powerful film. In 8th place, look, I know I'm one of the very few people in the world who likes these historical documentaries, and I know most of them think they're a titanic bore. Think yourself lucky I didn't choose Augustine of Hippo, which is one of my favourites. I think I'm the only person in the world who actually likes it. Anyway, but I've picked Age of the Medici, which is a 3-part TV series, which you can actually find on a box set from Criterion. I love it. It's about how economics and politics, this powerful family in Florence, this powerful family of bankers, were really part of creating the Renaissance, and how money, power, and art actually had to all sort of work their way out together to create this flowering of new information and knowledge. I find it fascinating. But then I really like Florence. Florence is beautiful, and I can look at Florence all day long. In 7th place, I've picked Roma Città Aperta, the film I mentioned earlier that begat the sort of Italian neorealist genre. You see, again there, what's interesting about that film is large chunks of that film are very melodramatic. You know, the scene where Anna Magnani gets gunned down by machine guns, which gets me every time. And then that whole last sequence with the priest and the children, the little boys, it's very melodramatic. It doesn't matter. That's not what Rossellini is interested in. He's interested in what he can reach through that melodrama. That's the greatness of the film. In 6th place, I've put The Taking of Power by Louis XIV. That film made such an impression on me when I first saw it. I remember being particularly... What I like about Rossellini is he tries to go for simple but very powerful moments that tell you everything you need to know. And what the film is about how Louis XIV tries to establish his own power, his own total dominion over his courtiers. And there's one brilliant scene where he's got this vast rectangular table that's set up on a dais above the hall. And he alone is sitting there. He's got all these dishes in front of him and he's just eating very quietly. And the camera pans back through all his courtiers just watching him. They have to stand and watch him eat. Nothing else needs to be said. That tells you everything you need to know about power. Okay, fifth place I've given to Paisa. Paisa was, I think, the best of Roberto Rossellini's neorealist films, purely neorealist films. It's a film in 6 parts. It's told in 6 little episodes. And the nominal theme of it is the liberation of Italy by the Americans and the way that the Americans and Italians interacted. That's the nominal theme, but actually I think what Rossellini is really exploring is Italy itself and the Italian people and their mentality and their morale as this went on. There's so many interesting things here. A lot of people, the most famous sequence perhaps is the sequence where a black American GI makes friends with this young street urchin, and the street urchin takes him back to where he lives, and they're living in the caves and the catacombs. Real appalling hardship. That's probably the most famous sequence. But the sequence that some people find a bit embarrassing is there's a scene where 3 American, they're sort of soldiers, but they're sort of holy men, like chaplains and stuff. They're taken to a monastery for refuge, and Roberto Rossellini used actual genuine Franciscan monks. And the story, which was written by Fellini, interestingly enough, is that the monks are concerned because one of the men is Jewish. And they're worried about it. Now, a lot of people find this episode a bit embarrassing. I think it's very beautiful. In this funny little story about these monks, is actually what the whole film is about, is overcoming these barriers that were there to build a new state after this appalling, devastating war, which was partly built on intolerance. In 4th place, The Flowers of St. Francis. Or Francis, God's Jester, as it's sometimes called. God, I love this film. Roberto Rossellini's portrait of St. Francis of Assisi. And he portrays St. Francis of Assisi and his monks rather like little boys. They're like little boys going out into the world to spread their simple message of faith. In Rossellini's films, faith is simple, but it's very powerful. And I love the end sequence. I absolutely love it. What happens is they decide to go their separate ways and spread their gospel, spread their word. So they don't want to choose where to go. So they spin round like little tops and they fall down on the ground. And wherever they end up facing, they just walk off in that direction. And it's incredibly moving. It's one of my favourite scenes in cinema. Now, the top 3 I gave to the 3 great Ingrid Bergman films because I think they are at the centre of European art cinema. So in 3rd place is Europa 51. This is the one I've probably watched the least. It's a film where Ingrid Bergman plays this sort of middle-class housewife of some industrialist or businessman, very well-to-do life. And then she suffers a tragedy. Her son commits suicide. And this turns her to charity. She feels she should do more for the world. And this comes into conflict with the interests of her class. And eventually, to sort of save her, her husband has her declared insane, and she's put in this sort of, rest home stroke asylum. And the end scene is Ingrid Bergman sort of, waving to her admirers out of the windows of her cell. A kind of bleak, sarcastic joke, I think, on Ingrid Bergman's personality from her own lover. Bit mean. But there's, again, Rossellini's quest for truth is not always pretty, I think this is a brilliant film. Not always an easy film to like, but one that you can easily admire, I think. In 2nd place is Stromboli, for all the reasons I've said. Also, the incredible ending, when she finally climbs the mountain, the volcano of Stromboli, and she has her experience with God. Sounds a bit ridiculous, but it's not when you're watching it. It's very, very moving. And I've put Viaggio in Italia Journey to Italy at number one. I've spoken about that film enough, but I could speak about it for hours more. I think that's one of the 5 or 6 most important films in my life. So I hope I've tried to get across why I think Roberto Rossellini is such an important director. I'd love to hear what you make of him and what your favourite films of his. Thanks very much for listening.